So thank you everyone for joining us. Tonight for this presentation, we're going to be using the webinar format. This means you won't be able to hear or see each other, but you'll be able to participate by inserting your questions into the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. We'll be recording the presentation tonight and we'll be sending a link to all the registrants. So we'll just get started. Actually, we could get started right about now with an introduction from Pat Sesto.
Good evening. Thank you, Laura. And thank you to the Coscop Library for partnering with the Conservation Commission to host this and bring our 4-part series to the public. I'm going to say the Zoom meetings, as much as they can seem like a hassle, and we're sorry that we don't get to see each other in person, I am delighted by the level of attendance that we get through our Zoom meetings. It's much easier to sit down in front of a screen for a little while life goes on behind you instead of coming out. So we are thrilled to have another strong night of participation. As a way of introduction, this is a 4-part series. This is our second of those 4 parts. We are focusing on air, land, and water, not in that order. Last week, we dealt with soil and the importance of that which lies beneath our feet and how the health of our soil is vitally important to how we survive on our land, how we eat, how we support our homes. So much is dependent on healthy soil. So I hope a good number of you were able to participate last week and have an appreciation that dirt just isn't dirt. This week, we are going to talk about water as part of that series with Jeff Ulrich from Aquarian and John Mulvaney of USDA. And John, I'm not going to get all of that, but I'm sure Elizabeth is going to do you justice on your introduction. And then I'm going to round out the trio. Next week, please come back as we talk about transportation and air quality. Certainly over the course of this last year, we've had some lovely trips on 95 without traffic. We've heard many a story about how our Earth is recovering while we stay shuttered in, and lots of things are happy for that shut in of ours. And then the final week, we'll wrap it up with climate change and how these topics all interrelate in our changing climate. So I hope you all enjoy this evening's presentation and come back for the next 2. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Dempsey, who is going to be our moderator this evening.
Great. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I'm Elizabeth Dempsey. I'm on the Greenwich Sustainability Committee, where I work on advocacy as well as land and water with some talented women. So I'm really excited to hear about the presentations, with water being one of the interests I've had recently. So we're going to kick it off with John Mulvaney. John is a hydrologist in the Connecticut office of the New England Water Science Center, where he is serving as the center's groundwater specialist. He began working at the U.S. Geological Society in 1986, working on both groundwater and water quality studies in Connecticut and in New England. John's current projects include groundwater levels in Cape Cod and other parts of Massachusetts, and a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts here in Greenwich, the study of nitrogen loads in Long Island Sound. And he has also served on the Long Island Sound study, which is a great interest to me. So we're excited to have you. Welcome, John, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad to hear that so many people are joining. I think what I'll do is let me start by sharing my screen, and let's try that again. Let's see. I think we're getting there. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Good.
Okay, it looks like I got, I'm a little bit covered up with things, but I think everybody can see it. So yeah, so I'm a hydrologist for the U.S. Geological Survey. We're an agency under the U.S. Department of Interior. I was just on a call today with our new, we had a all interior department call with the new Secretary of the Interior. But anyway, this is a good topic. I presented on this, I was going to say about 2 years ago about this time in southeastern Massachusetts on a very similar forum. And I took some of the information that I had from that presentation, but I also tried to make it a little more Greenwich centric. Back about 20 years ago, I worked on a study with the town of Greenwich on their groundwater resources, and we had a report back then that we worked on looking at water use and water availability and groundwater recharge in Greenwich. So I am somewhat familiar with the issues, although I know like the local issues change with time, especially as 20 years go by, a lot of things can change. Anyway, I thought I'd start with a picture of the Byram River in Pemberwick here, where we have a, USGS river gauge right now, where we're measuring the flow and monitoring the weather as well down there. And I thought I would start with either our take-home messages or really what I was calling answers to questions. So, some of our questions we get, and this talk is going to be kind of about our water budgets, but how much water is there? How much water is available for use? And I think we often think of our fresh water all ends up in rivers. So I sort of say, what are the sources of water to streams, and what pathway does that water follow when it gets there? How does the system vary and naturally, and then of course, how do human activities affect this system? And I think at the end I'll touch a little bit also on just some thoughts to think about how some of these things might change under climate change too. So when we think about all of our water needs, we live in a world where there's competing demands for the use of water. We all need water to live. um, we have competing demands for that water for public and private water supplies, to maintain habitats. Um, it's used for irrigation and agriculture and for residential areas. Some of our rivers, we need a certain amount of water in those rivers to dilute effluent from wastewater, um, or have enough water in there so we can take care of fire protection, particularly in rural areas where we might use some, dry hydrants and things like that where they're off of the system. It's also, there's also competing demands for recreation, our fishermen, kayakers, and even in Connecticut, we not particularly in Greenwich, but we do have hydroelectric, power generation as well. I just happen to show a river here. We were supposed to be monitoring flow this summer. This is up in Cheshire, Connecticut, but this is the Mill River, which was actually totally dried up this summer. So this is kind of the extreme event, but we've had a couple of droughts in the last few years. So I'll touch on that as well. When we as hydrologists think about how much water is available somewhere, we usually, one of the things we often start talking about is the just had somebody calling my cell phone here. Anyway, one of the things we talk about is the runoff, which is kind of like we think about I'm just turning off my cell phone, make sure I don't get any more calls here. Sorry about that. We think about the volume of water that passes a certain point on a river. So if you could collect up all that water over the course of a whole year, and then if you could take that water and spread it over the entire drainage area or the watershed that contributes to that river, how deep is that water? How much, and it turns out it's quite a bit in New England. We're in a pretty wet part of the world. If we look at, for instance, our runoff and our precipitation, one of the points I wanted to make is we tend to get a lot more precipitation than we get runoff. That kind of makes sense, but we get somewhere on the order of 40 to 60 inches of precipitation every year. And of that 40 to 60 inches, we probably only have about 20 to 35 or 40 inches that comes out of our stream. So roughly half of that water kind of just disappears. And that's the water, really. It's mostly due to evapotranspiration. So that's the water that falls on trees, is intercepted by the canopy, it evaporates. That's the water that's taken up by all of our plants, at least in a natural system. So if we use kind of an average value of what comes out of our streams, it's the equivalent of about 24 inches. So think of about 2 feet of water over that whole watershed, which comes down to about, if you think about it, it's a lot of water. It's about 1.1 or 1.2 million gallons per day for every square mile. So there is a lot of water out there. And I'm showing this example. I'm showing is fairly nearby Sasko Brook, which is one of the sites where we have a river gauge, and some of that data is available if anybody wants to take a look at it. So just looking at kind of our standard hydrologic cycle here, if you want to call it that, we have precipitation that falls on our land surface that it's either in the form of rain or snow. We get evaporation that I just talked about a little bit there. That's a lot of our water disappears there. You can have I'll talk about other places where we get evaporation, but we do get groundwater recharge. Part of that water, especially seasonally, sinks into the ground down to our water table and becomes groundwater that flows to streams. The other big source of water we often call the surface runoff, which is kind of like, you think about the water you see, running down your driveway when you get a heavy rain and you see that water just flowing over the ground. Although it's probably more than that. A lot of times it's probably flowing through shallow soil layers, but it's finding its way towards the stream. You can get some evaporation here too, down in, where you get direct evaporation from the groundwater by, trees that are right along, say, a stream channel where the groundwater table is shallow too. One of the things we don't think about a lot is that, between our rainstorms, which are fairly frequent, there's water still flowing in our rivers, right? So the water is still coming down those streams, and the reason those streams are flowing is they're being served by groundwater that's discharging to the rivers, especially in our natural streams that are unregulated by dams or anything. So one of the things that we look at in terms of that stream flow that comes from groundwater over the long term is roughly equal to the amount of groundwater recharge that we get. So it's roughly equivalent to that amount of water that soaks into the ground in our area. And it's important. This is an important source of stream flow in the summer. It keeps our reservoirs, keeps water flowing into some of our reservoirs when it's been dry otherwise, or into our streams, and keeps that cool, clear habitat that cold water fish like. But one of the things we talk about a little bit with the recharge in an area like I'm showing the town of Greenwich and the surficial geology here. So in a lot of Connecticut, we get quite a bit of recharge in these sand and gravel deposit areas, which are shown in orange here. So these are glacial deposits of layered sand and gravel. In other parts of Connecticut, we have a lot more of these. In southwestern Connecticut, and particularly in Greenwich, there's very few of them. Most of the surficial material for the geology is a thin layer of glacial till over bedrock. So if you've ever seen one of those digital elevation maps of somewhere like Greenwich, you can actually see all the structures in the bedrock. It's so close to the surface. You see faults and fractures that follow a lot of our streams and everything. And so we have this thin veneer of glacial till. The glacial till tends to have fairly low groundwater recharge, meaning that the soils are not that permeable. But they might also be because there's steeper slopes on some of these surfaces as well. So the things that affect the rates of groundwater recharge are the precipitation, geology, temperature, and season. We'll talk a little bit more about, because we primarily get recharge during the non-growing season to groundwater. Soil type and geology are kind of closely related here, but how wet is the soil as well? What do we have for vegetation cover and slopes? Because in steeper slopes, you tend to get more surface runoff too. So an average rate for Greenwich area with these areas of thin glacial till is probably about 8 inches per year, more or less, which is pretty small. And I should add that these areas of coarse grain sand and gravel, the stratified drift areas, these get about 20 inches a year of recharge. So they're definitely areas where we get a little bit more water into the ground. One of the things I wanted to show was, how the groundwater levels change. And we happen to have a couple of they're now long-term observation wells that we began with the town of Greenwich back when we did our study around 2001. And one of the things I wanted to show is the groundwater levels tend to rise. This is actually over here. So I have the elevation of groundwater on this side, and I'm showing precipitation events down here on this axis in inches. So each one of these is a rainfall event. And what I'm showing here is the water level going up and down in our well with the seasons. This happens to be for 2019 through 2021. So what we see a lot of is the water levels tend to start rising about in October, right around the time we get the first frost. So once those trees stop taking up the water, all of a sudden we get some rain. The water levels start rising, and once we get back into the growing season around May or June, we just really start to see the water levels decline. So what's happening here is we don't get much recharge, or we're getting less recharge than the amount of water that's discharging away to streams. So the water levels in our aquifers start to drop. And we do get a few little bumps here and there in the summer. Even this was our drought year right here. But you can see the same thing happening again at the end of our drought. When the drought finally broke from this last year in October, our water levels started to go up again. So one of the important points to take home here, though, is the timing of, one of the things that can lead to drought is losing this time window when we get the groundwater, we get recharged to the groundwater. So this sort of non-growing season, let's say October through May, when we get a lot of that water in the ground. And I'll talk a little bit more about, these are a couple of the same wells, but I was showing for a longer time period with some statistics. The red lines are the low and the high for any given month. The black triangles are sort of monthly values over this time period. 2016 drought is here. 2020 is here. So we weren't quite as severe as in 2016, but one of the things that led to the drought in 2016 was a number of years where we got less than normal recharge during that important time period. And on this side, I'm showing some differences here where I wanted to show that there's, on our hilltops and our valley bottoms, we tend to get a different range of fluctuations. On our hilltops and our hillsides, we can have a big range of water level fluctuation, which is kind of important because I think sometimes it makes the hilltop areas, especially for private wells, maybe more susceptible to having problems. Down in the valley bottom, where we're down by a river, we get a smaller amount of fluctuation from year to year. And one of the things you always think about on a valley bottom versus a hilltop, you have a lot of area possibly above you where that groundwater can still be flowing in, say if you have a well there where your water supply is coming from. Anyway, I'll move along on that with the graphs. But getting in towards the end of the presentation here, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what are some of the changes to this groundwater and surface water system due to human activities, primarily related to urbanization. So, some of the things that we do that change the balance of these things is, we withdraw water from reservoirs and we transfer water between different basins, and as part of making our water supplies resilient. We have large groundwater withdrawals in some cases, and also private wells, which maybe are small withdrawals, but maybe we have a lot of them. And some of the things I'll mention a little bit more about is we tend to pump the water from our private wells and then return it through septic systems. And then we have impervious surfaces that make some changes to the water budget too. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I've got a couple more slides on these issues. And lastly, I'll just mention too about other, how some of our water exits our system through our sewer systems too. We lose a certain amount of water just because of that transfer of water from public water supply and then discharge to a sewer or Long Island Sound. The one thing that I don't really have time to touch on in this talk is many of these changes have implications for water quality as well. And so if we look at the groundwater pumping, I'll start with that, being the groundwater hydrologist. I'll talk about that first. And as I mentioned before, our groundwater recharge and discharge tend to be sort of balanced over the long term. But once we start to pump groundwater from that system, there's two possible outcomes. We could have a decrease in the discharge end of it. So that, if you take water out, there's probably going to be less water that discharges naturally to streams. The other consequence might be when you do the pumping is the stress of the pumping might reach out and start pulling in water from other areas. So that might be we start pumping groundwater, and maybe there's a pond or a reservoir or a river nearby that's got some water in it that maybe can be, pulled into the groundwater system. So those are two of those possible consequences. I was going to add, I got a couple more slides here on some of these ways we reroute that water. So in areas like the north of Greenwich, we have private wells and septic systems. So we pump water from a deep aquifer that's usually down in the bedrock, and then we return maybe something like maybe up to 85% of that through our septic system. On the other hand, the water that we use for irrigation is often sort of lost to evapotranspiration, especially for watering correctly. We're trying to water the plant needs. And so that outdoor water use is often considered our sort of biggest consumptive water use. There are other probably consumptive water uses too, obviously, but they're small in comparison to the outdoor water use. We also have areas in Greenwich, or at least we did, or at least there were, 20 years ago when I was working in town, where we have areas with public water supply and private septic systems. So this is a case where we're actually bringing in wastewater as an additional source of recharge here. So this is kind of an imported source of water that's then entering locally through our septic system. And one of the things I wanted to mention about both of these return flows from septic systems is, in this case, we pump from a deep well and we return, and maybe it takes a different path to a stream, or you're returning it to a shallow system where then it takes a different pathway to a stream. And here, and it's one of those things that may represent a change in water quality too locally, if you have enough density of septic systems. And so lastly, the one thing I just want to talk about too is, with our areas with public water and sewers, it's a little bit different, but we have water that maybe comes from our headwaters, from reservoirs and things like that, or possibly even from outside the area if there's interconnections. And then that water ends up getting discharged maybe directly to Long Island Sound. And there, one other area to think about too, and I don't think there's probably any, or there may be very few areas left in Greenwich that have this, but we do have areas in the state that have private wells and sewer systems. And so that's another case where if you pump that groundwater and discharge it to a sewer, it's kind of it's another source of water that's kind of lost from that water budget. Oh, lastly, I forgot about this one. We were going to talk about impervious cover. This is actually data from my study back around 2000, where we had a couple of river gauges in Greenwich, and we monitored. We did a comparison of some storm events. So this is the river flow during a couple of storm events, and what it shows is, if you had, say, 10% impervious cover in a watershed versus 4%, is that you get quite a different response in the stream flow. So when you have these big rainfall events, the stream with more impervious cover is flashier, and you get this high, fast peak in stream flow. And the other thing that's notable about that is once you get past the storm, the stream flow is much lower. So the stream with the less impervious cover has a smaller storm peak, and it's kind of holding the water for longer. This is probably is release of some local shallow groundwater that's right next to the stream here, slowly going back to the stream. So, you have the possibility of the loss of recharge too in this system, as well as the possibility of creating some nuisance flooding or, erosion type of flooding that might occur in some of our urbanized streams. Anyway, lastly, I just thought I would touch on to everybody to think a little bit about, and it's good to hear that maybe you'll be talking about climate change in one of the later series of this of these events. But we think about with a changing climate that we might have greater precipitation in this part of the world, but it might be more variable, and we may have more extreme events, more extreme wet or extreme dry, or for longer time periods of either. We will likely see a smaller proportion of our precipitation coming as snowfall, and that has implications for the changes in the volume and the timing of that recharge and runoff. And some of the other things we think about are warmer temperatures and a longer growing season. Is there a greater evapotranspiration, or will we see greater water demand? And lastly, I just wanted to mention, it's probably not particularly relevant to Greenwich, but in some areas in New England, we certainly have public water supplies in coastal areas where rising groundwater levels, and especially if they're salty groundwater, as well as inundation of coastal water supplies, is a possibility. So I guess with that, I will that concludes my presentation on this, and I'll be glad to take some questions at the end.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, John. That was interesting, and we already have a couple of questions for you. So stick around for the end. And now we're going to turn to Jeff Ulrich. Speaking of dealing with climate change issues and keeping and pumping the ground, we are grateful to Aquarian, and Jeff is a real master. He's worked in the water industry for over 30 years. As Aquarian's water company's vice president of supply and sustainability. He oversees 85 people that produce drinking water for over 625,000 people in Connecticut. The department operates 23 reservoirs, 9 water treatment plants, 101 pump stations, 328 wells, and 74 water storage tanks. Jeff joined Aquarian in 2014 as director of supply operations and has a really unique perspective with both working for a water company and utilizing his consulting experience and contractor background. Jeff worked for Acon, again at Fleming, and for the Elizabethtown Water Company in engineering, transmission, and distribution and construction departments. Welcome, Jeff. You and Aquarian's reputation really precedes you, because I've heard for years about the great partnership that Aquarian has had with the town of Greenwich, and working hand in hand, especially with droughts like we had in 2016. So we really appreciate this working relationship, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to pull my thing up, my presentation. Can you see that?
Yes.
And you can see that? Okay. So just a quick introduction. The topic of the night is Greenwich facing a water shortage. We talked about 2016. That's where we got a lot of experience working with Greenwich. I got particularly a lot of experience working with Greenwich around the drought of 2016. And then fall of 2020 comes along, and the question is, not again, what's going on? We have to impose a mandatory irrigation ban in the fall of 2020. And just looking back at 2016, it was more, we had a more extreme event in 2016, but we'll get into it. 2020 was a pretty severe event as well. But if you remember, that's the Barge Reservoir, that's in Stamford. That's the reservoir that serves the majority of the water to Greenwich. It got very low, got down to, on the order of, it was like 65 days of remaining supply, 66 days of remaining supply. And we ended up making a lot of modifications to bring more water down, including putting pipes along the Merritt Parkway. There were definitely lessons learned from 2016. It reminded us that we're dealing with a limited resource. Again, the system was operating at close to its design capacity, and it's been doing that for quite a while. In addition to that, there are the stream flow rules, which I imagine most of the people on this call know about, but 10 years out, or now it's under 10 years, I think it's on the order of 8 years, there's a requirement for all dams and reservoirs to release more water to downstream from the reservoirs to improve the water quality downstream from the reservoirs, which is it seems like a fantastic idea from an environmental perspective, but it also means we have less water in our reservoirs. So it's going to have a contributing effect or reduce more the water available in our existing reservoirs. So we just agreed that there was a need for developing some additional modern reservoir management. There's some new things we're taking advantage of. Looking at demand management for not only Greenwich, but the towns up and down Southeast Fairfield County, and also seeing what we could do to find additional capacity. This is a grant, we had a woman we worked with, she's out of Massachusetts, a woman named Amy Vickers. She's a nationally known water conservation expert. And she had done a study of our water use, and this is Greenwich. Now, we've got one of these for most of our big towns and some regional areas as well. There's a lot of information here, but it really pointed out where we were having, you know, where our real, where we thought we had the most opportunity. The green line, you know, so I guess looking along the bottom, each group of bars represents a percentage of the customers, and this is single family water use. The green line represents how much that bar represents of the total water use. And then the blue represents winter water use, and the red represents outdoor summer water use. And what you can see, so if you follow along all the way to the left, that's the average of all of our customers. And the average customer, this is total customer, so it's like, you know, on the average of 3 or 4 people per house, they're using on the order of, you know, less than 500 gallons a day. If you go to the next grouping, and that represents 100% of the water use in the town, that's our top 1% of our customers. And what you can see is they're using 9% of the water supply in Greenwich. Of all the water we supply, the top 1% are using 9%. The next grouping is the top 10%. They're using almost 40% of the water in Greenwich. And then the top 25% are using 61% of the water in Greenwich. The amazing thing is all the way to the right is the bottom 50%. Half of the customers in Greenwich are only using 18% of the water. So what it really pointed out to us is a good portion of the customers in Greenwich are water conscious. And, you know, 50% of the customers really use very little water. I mean, that's on the order of being, you know, a lot of people would call like an ultra low water use, to using that little water. And half of the customers in Greenwich are at that level. And even when you get to that next 25% or so, it's a reasonable amount, but it's not really the top 25% that's really using water way out of range of the rest of the town. And that's where the demands, you know, that's what it is really. 25% of the people are creating so much demand, they're kind of exasperating the problem. And we, you know, so we really looked at that as having the most potential of savings going forward. So what we did do is we implemented the 2-day-a-week irrigation policy, and I think most people are aware of this. It's 2 days a week maximum, even addresses odd addresses, you know, Sundays, Wednesdays, or Saturday, Tuesdays. And it applies to automatic sprinkler systems and sprinklers attached to the ends of hoses. It does not apply to handheld watering, does not apply to drip irrigation, it does not apply to soaker hoses. And the reason we chose this is when we talked, you know, to our water conservation expert, also other systems across the country, this really offered the most potential savings, on the order of 20% savings. You know, a lot in some systems have even seen more than that, but they have longer irrigation periods than we do. And it was, we thought, fairly easy to implement as well. It's something we could roll out fairly quickly and have a big impact. There is a variance process, you know, I won't get into all that tonight, but if you have a new landscaping, or you've got a big property, or you've got a high efficiency, you can go through a variance process and water outside the schedule. So just looking at now 2020, so along the bottom here, I don't know how well you can see that, each group of bars represents a year. So all the way to the left, that's 2010 to 2015. Then the next group of bars is 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20. And what they represent, the red is the amount of rainfall that we received May through August, and the green is the number of rain days. And if you look at 2016, that's the second group of bars from the left. You can see that was the summer of 2016 when we had our drought, and it's amongst the lowest, you know, even, but not necessarily a lot lower than everybody else. It's comparable to 2017. But last year, 2020, was lower in both cases. We had fewer rain days in 2020 and less rainfall in 2020 than we did in 2016. So it was a pretty dry year in 2020, more so than I think most people recognized. But what we did have is, if you look at the demands, so looking at the 2016 demands versus the 2020, and you can see here the difference in Greenwich. We received about, in the area, about almost 2 inches less rainfall between May and August, but our demands in Greenwich were on the order of 1.4 million gallons per day lower than they had been in 2016. So we do feel, you know, we've been tracking this quite a bit, that those outdoor irrigation restrictions have had a positive impact on demands. And what we ended up using was, when you multiply out May through August, we used 173 million gallons less water in 2020 than we did in 2016. If you look at the graph, so this is a reservoir graph, and we use these to track all of our reservoirs. The green line represents the 20-year average through the year. So along the bottom is a calendar. Along the left side is the percent of the reservoir being full. You can see, similar to what John was mentioning, in the fall, January, it's still going up. We expect this to spill sometime between March, April, May, and then it'll come again down through the summer and then start going back up again in the fall. And that's the 20-year average, the green line. The gold line is 2016. The light blue line was 2019, and the dark blue line was 2020. And so we had less rainfall and fewer rain days in 2020 as we did in 2016. But really that blue line was able to stay on the order of 5%, 10% above where it was in 2016 because of that saving. So it did, it's a noticeable change in the behavior of our reservoir and gave the system, more capacity to get through, even if the drought had been more severe. So we are happy with the results of the irrigation restrictions and the amount of water it's saving right now. And you can see it, here's another graph. So this is days of the week. So each group of the bars represents a day of the week. So from the left, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Each color represents a different period of time. The blue is 2010 to 2015. The red is 2016. The green is 2017. Purple is 2018. And the light blue is 2019. And what you can see is 2010 to 2016. The blue and the red are noticeably higher every single day of the week. And since we put the outdoor 2-day-a-week watering in, you can see that since then, 2017, 18, 19, every single day of the week, the water demand is substantially lower than it had been prior to that. So we think this again reinforces the positive outcome of the irrigation restrictions that we've implemented. But what you can see is this is 2020, and you can see that orange line, the orange bar is 2020, that line jumped up in 2020. And so there's a couple things there. It was a very dry summer. It was drier. We still used less water than we did in 2016, but we did jump up, but it was a drier year than the other 2 years. And I guess the other thing that we want to point out is if you look at our non-watering days, that's the Monday, Thursday, Friday, you can see that the jump up was more substantial on our non-watering days. So there is some concern. COVID was tough last year. It was a very, very, I don't know if everybody remembers, it was a very dry May, and a lot of people were home. And I think a lot of people did projects, and it was so dry, they started, they wanted to protect their investments, their projects, and, probably got into some old habits. And so we did see what we think is a little bit of a reversion back to watering, outside of that schedule. So in summary, so what we have done, and I didn't really talk about tonight, we've implemented some additional modern reservoir management. So we're using computer models to project out what our reservoirs look like, the forecasting, what the likelihood of different levels are over the next 9 months to a year. And what we do is it allows us to go into restrictions sooner. I don't know how everybody remembers, but in 2016, we didn't really put in place restrictions or start talking about restriction till July and August is the first time we started asking people to make, to reduce their water use. And in September, we ended up implementing the water ban. But last year, we started contacting, setting up messaging in May and even in June, because we had that advanced knowledge of, okay, the projections are indicating we have a high likelihood of getting into drought curve. So we're using that to try to get the message out sooner and start making those kind of decisions easier. We think demand management has definitely helped. Like we said, we on the order of 200 million gallons of savings, but we are concerned that there might be some return of old habits in 2020 that we need to reinforce. So we are intending to come out with a strong communication program this spring to reinforce that the 2-day-a-week program and try to get back to the better habits we had developed a couple of years ago. We have put additional capacity in place so that we have increased our interconnections inside Greenwich itself, and between Stamford and even from the Barge Reservoir. We're improving those. We've already increased those capacities to make more water available, and there is additional projects in place in order to bring some additional capacity down to Greenwich and Stamford as well, just to reinforce the system so that if we did have a problem, we wouldn't, we've got more capacity to offset some of those demands. And that's all I had for tonight. I hope I give you a quick little summary of the water system and where we are.
That's fantastic, Jeff. Thank you so much. So interesting to hear about the actual supply. And I know I have some questions about some of the changes that may be coming down the pike. And now we're going to turn to Pat Sesto, whose department really has had a large part in helping to educate our residents about the importance of water conservation. And in fact, some of the benefits you can have with to your lawns and gardens by reducing irrigation to 2 times a week. So Pat has been with our Greenwich Wetlands Agency as director for the town since 2015 and became the head of our Town of Greenwich Department of Environmental Affairs in 2018. She began her professional career with consulting firms where she worked with engineers, sanitarians, and landscape architects. And before she came to Greenwich, she was the director of environmental affairs for 23 years in Wilton and a past conservation commissioner in her hometown of Ridgefield. Additionally, Pat has the distinction of being the gubernatorial appointee to represent Connecticut on the Interstate Environmental Commission. And she's also been the past president of the Norwalk River Valley Trail. So thank you so much, Pat, for all you do for Greenwich, and looking forward to hearing your presentation tonight.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's my pleasure to be here. So tonight we are going to talk about regulations as they relate to water shortage, or if they do their job, the lack thereof. So within the town of Greenwich, we've got rules, regulations, and then ultimately it comes back to the individuals with personal responsibility. Jeff and John have done a wonderful job in laying out for us our groundwater and our surface water, and gave us an understanding of how those things are important to our very fabric of potable water, as well as sustaining the natural resources around us. So generally, people are sincere and they understand the value of water, but they don't always individually know how to protect it. So we do have a number of sources in town for regulations to protect our water supply. And I understand tonight's conversation is basically about quantity, but I can't help myself. I've got to throw quality in there too. No good having water if it's bad water, ask Flint, Michigan. So water quantity, we've got regulations that talk about our inland wetlands and water courses regulations. We have a progressive stormwater management manual in the town. We have water use restrictions, not only those restrictions that Jeff spoke about, but there's also a local ordinance that deals with private wells. And then the health department has its regulations relating to wells. For water quality, basically the wetland regulations and our stormwater management manual mostly deal with our quality issues. So why do we protect our wetlands? For years, our country, decades, was raised to consider wetlands as wasteland. We had the Swamp Busters Act. Across the country, you were rewarded for reclaiming wetlands. That's a funny word to me to use for this. Reclaiming suggests that it was something better before, and now we fixed it by filling it or building on it or draining it and all the other things that we have manipulated our wetlands. We have learned the hard way, for sure, that when we reclaim, bust our swamps, and the other manipulations to our wetlands, we lose valuable natural resource services. Our groundwater is recharged through wetlands. When the groundwater is low, the water that comes into a wetland tends to percolate downward and keep our groundwater levels sustained. When those groundwater levels are sustained, that water flows outward and then discharges into our water courses, which provides for base flow of those water courses, which keeps them running, and then it keeps them cool, which is important for healthier aquatic organisms to live in those areas. Flood control. Wetlands, the best wetlands for flood control are the ones that are broad and flat, probably associated with a good sized river or water course. And when the water comes in, it resides there for a while, and that helps us in a number of ways. And then they cleanse pollutants. Wetlands are fabulous at this, although we can certainly overtax that resource as we have any number of times. Regulations as a whole are there to protect you, the individual, from the uninformed decisions of others. Water resources are shared resources, and we don't always know what the best decision is. So regulations draw our attention to that and let entities who do have a better understanding help individuals guide their decisions. So wetlands protect surface water, sedimentation, erosion. So the flood amelioration, when water makes its way to these broad, flat areas, the energy that is in that stormwater, when they hit a broad, flat area, that energy lessens, and the erosive potential lessens, and the damage that can be done as rough water flows through areas. Wetlands do a terrific job in absorbing that potential. They also stage the floodwaters. So waters will kind of sit back, chill out in our wetlands, and then over time will work their way down either through groundwater or out through a water course, which instead of having all the water coming at one time, it's metered out over time, which is less damaging to our landscape, be it a developed landscape or a natural landscape. There is pollution reduction. If you think about the storms that come through our summer months, we saw in those graphs, we've got some good ones that come through. That water frequently is flowing off of our heated paved surfaces, our roofs. And if they were to go directly into water courses, that's a big input of warmed water, which doesn't hold as much oxygen, doesn't support the diversity of wildlife that we would like to see. But when it takes some time out and literally chills out in the wetland, the impacts of thermal pollution are reduced. When that water is sitting in the wetland, it's intermingling with the soils, with the vegetation, and there's chemical reactions where the pollutants can be bound up in the soil or plants, taking it out of our water column. And taking it for the parts that bind to soil and to plants, keeps it from our groundwater table. And the solids, as I said earlier, the water comes in and relaxes. And when you take that energy out of the water, the sediments drop. And that again helps keep our water courses clearer. And as we know, our water courses are the ones that feed our reservoirs. So to the extent that the surrounding landscape can retain the pollutants, it's better for our groundwater, which we drill our wells into, and it keeps that much more pollutants from entering our reservoirs. As John spoke of earlier, most of the streams in our streams and water courses in this part of the country are gaining streams, in that the high water table is discharging into the water course. But we do have some streams that the groundwater is pulling from our streams, and then there are times when the groundwater level gets so low that there's actually a separation between the two. That illustration is helpful when you think about our wells that we are drilling into the surface of our earth. Wells will be our more shallow wells around here, are 100 feet or so, and then they go on up to several hundred feet, and if you're in a really tough way, they can be 800,000 feet deep. But mostly we are blessed with an enormous amount of groundwater that we don't see those things happen. I think in my 30-something years, there's only been 2 properties I know of where they could not get a minimum of 10 gallons per minute. So it's pretty extraordinary. But our personal wells do draw directly from that groundwater. So ensuring the quality of water that percolates through our ground and consists of our groundwater that we then pull out and utilize, ensuring that that is clean is vitally important. Our wetlands do a big job toward that end. I think, I forget if it was John or Jeff, probably John, that spoke of where you have major drawdowns of our water table from irrigation wells. We don't have as much agricultural around here, so that's not one of our major drawdowns. We actually heard from Jeff before we went on that our golf courses don't draw down quite as much as we all think they do. They're quite judicious in the amount of water they pull. But I have seen applications that come through where somebody, I think this would probably be one of the top 1%ers that Jeff spoke of, where there was a 6-acre property who was looking to drill wells to fully irrigate that 6 acres. So there is a point in which the individual decisions on a property affect the water table and people beyond their own property boundaries. So that's why the regulations exist, to ensure that the personal decisions aren't negatively impacting those beyond. I'll say for me, my personal experience back in 2016, I would have what I would consider a shallow well that it's just over 100 feet. It went dry 5 times during the fall of 2016. So we have to be careful. These threats are real. We also spoke a bit about watershed. So we get why we regulate wetlands in the context of preserving our groundwater and having our surface water renovated and our groundwater recharged by protecting those wetlands. But stormwater is another big factor, and I think it's EPA considers stormwater runoff the largest pollutant in the United States. This is a little diagram of a watershed. So if you look at the outer boundaries of this little landscape area, those are the tops of hills or mountains. And you can see everything that falls to the inside slowly accumulates and works its way down to the low point here in the little village center. So all of the decisions that are made throughout this watershed are reflected in the stormwater that passes over and through it. That's why we regulated. Stormwater management, I just gotta make us go away because I can't see what I'm reading here. Stormwater management manual is a recognition that the individual decisions that property owners make necessarily collect and cause headaches for others. This is actually this is from Hurricane Irene in Old Greenwich, which I'm sure a number of people who are viewing this tonight have distinct memories of. So the goal of the Stormwater Management Manual is to have each expansion of impervious coverage on each property be responsible for its own runoff. When we fail to mimic the water cycle, which is precipitation down, contributes to groundwater, some runoff, some evapotranspiration, that collectively, failing to mimic that, collectively causes problems to others. So our individual decisions, again, collectively impacting somebody else. That's why we regulate. Infiltration is a key point in what our manual demands, and it demands this for several reasons. Not only water quantity, but water quality. Infiltration reduces our pollutants associated with our runoff. The slide to the left, this is one of the always a favorite when you're watering your driveway. It's not going to grow. Keeping irrigation water on your irrigation target. When we have, be it irrigation water or stormwater runoff, hit these impervious surfaces, as I said, the pollutants, all the decisions within the watershed collect, and you can see at the bottom right-hand side of that screen is a catch basin. Catch basins invariably connect to other pipes, which might connect to another pipe, work your way through the system, long or short, it's going into a watercourse or a wetland. We can see those drain to the sound on catch basins, and you'll be surprised how far you are from the sound, and that connects to the sound. Or for more inland properties, it connects to a wetland or watercourse. Our infrastructure has made these direct connections, which makes it imperative for us to manage our stormwater. You can do it. To the slide to the right is a rain garden. So managing our stormwater doesn't have to be a negative aesthetic. It can really be quite beautiful part of our landscape in which we are being responsible in the stormwater, which we generate on our own property, and try to work it back into the ground to keep the groundwater level up and the water quality level up. The local ordinance that Greenwich has, again, we're front runners on this one. I'll say kudos to Greenwich for having implemented this. This precedes me, so I take absolutely no credit, but I'm thrilled that we have it. Many times we get into these drought situations like we did last year, back in 2016, and people on wells are like, my well, my problem, and we know that's not the case. Because Greenwich has an ordinance affecting individual wells, we can look at things holistically, such as groundwater levels, forecasts, and complement what Aquarian is seeing in their surface water and work towards helping our groundwater levels stay high too. The 2-day-a-week limitation on irrigation, that is permanent. I still get, even, how many years later, people say, oh, is the ban still on this year? I'm like, no, this is permanent. This is the way we live now. It is the norm. And I have had no complaints about people who have an established lawn saying the 2-day-a-week thing's not working for me. My lawn still can't survive. We can. I think in 2016, Jeff, there was a woman from Texas who said, if Texans can do well and thrive with irrigation 2 days a week, Connecticut sure can. So then the local ordinance allows us to institute further restrictions during drought construction. And those, again, complement the ones that Jeff spoke about with Aquarian. So we are on the same page with how we should use this precious commodity, our potable commodity. And again, this local ordinance goes back to protecting a common resource, our water. And if there is no regulation, you are on your own to make sustainable choices. So in the quality realm of making choices, and remember that quality of the surface water in your backyard contributes to the quality of the stream that goes into, and then so on and so on. Maybe it goes to the reservoir, maybe it goes to the sound, maybe it goes to your pond. Dog waste. Pound of poop per dog per day. On average, big dogs, little dogs, it changes. So if we have 16,000 families in Greenwich, and we have an average based on licensing of 1.6 dogs on average, it's 25,000 pounds of poop every day. We don't all do a great job of picking it up. So when it poops, then it rains, the bacteria, the nitrogen wash across the landscape. Go to the car wash. Gone should be the days where we are soaping up our cars in the driveway. If we can afford it, if it's within our means, go to the car wash. Most of our driveways either drain to a nice drain in our private driveway or drain out to the road where it hits a catch basin. But again, all the catch basins eventually go to a wetland or a watercourse. Riparian buffers, bottom left. Protecting our watercourses from the things that occur on our residential and our suburban landscapes. Just a simple buffer, 10, 15 feet wide minimum, does a whole lot to help strain out some of those pollutants, supports increased infiltration, and protects that water resource that we're depending on for so much else. The biggest one, I hope our big takeaway today, have less lawn. At a rate of 1 pound of nitrogen per acre in a given year, Greenwich has 630 acres of lawn. So if we're equally putting down nitrogen across all those acres of lawn, that means we're putting down 630,000 pounds of nitrogen per application. So if you're spraying in the fall, it's ×2. In the summer, 50% of the water demand is for irrigation. That is our potable water that we are sprinkling out onto our lawns, our potable water. And Jeff has made it clear we're doing much better, and that's terrific news. Think about potable water on our lawns. And can you do less? Do you need as much lawn? The options to lawn are wonderful. If meadows with native vegetation and deep roots are drought resistant, they are far less maintenance than a lawn is. You don't have to mow them every week, I can tell you that. And you'll love the sound of, it's nothing quite as good as summer evenings with a meadow and hearing the life in it. And then you stand out in the middle of a lawn, you don't hear it. They just don't support wildlife the way a diverse landscape would. And diversity of plants is beautiful. We came here from Europe with this aesthetic for a lawn. We don't live in the climate of England. So lawns are a big draw for us. So let's rethink what is beautiful and work towards that and be beautiful inside and out. And there are a bunch of other easy options. Have less impervious pavement associated with your properties. Either use pavers or pervious pavements, which could be porous asphalt, pervious concrete. There's so many choices. Have smaller paved areas. I appreciate people who entertain and like to have their guests be able to park easily. You can have areas that are lawned, but have a grid underneath them so that on any given day when you're not entertaining, you don't need that many cars. You don't have to have pavement just out there. You can have lawn with a grid underneath it that would support the cars on the day you do have it. Disconnect your downspouts. This one, the third one from the left, that's a downspout going into an elevated garden area. There's so many options where your downspout can go to a garden instead of into that PVC pipe that works its way out to some point in your yard or to a wetland in a stream. It's not healthy. There's a lot of pollutants that come off of our roofs, and it's really important to take that roof runoff and get it back into the ground. Maintain and or plant more trees. Evapotranspiration aside, they are still great. Trees help keep our soil healthy and aerated. The roots break through things along with all kinds of other organisms that keep our soil more porous, which is just the ultimate goal when you talk about promoting infiltration. Use a rain barrel. It's little, but can you imagine if we just multiplied that out the way we multiply out dog poop? What a difference it could make. The little rain barrel that can order small sections of a garden or your herbs or any other special little area that you might have. Aerate and compost lawn to increase infiltration. Again, the runoff that we get, whether it's from steep slopes, compacted soils, lawn versus more interesting vegetative cover. If you do have a lawn, make sure that it's aerated so that the infiltration is at its peak. The roots of the grass are deeper, therefore then you don't have to water them as much. It'll be great. And then another easy option that didn't make it on here is definitely the smart irrigation systems. Irrigation that is tripped when the rainfall amounts demand it. So it's not just 2 days a week, it's 2 days a week as needed. The smart systems, I think, are pretty prevalent nowadays. And it seems like just an obvious thing to do. So I would think that that's another easy option for people when they're replacing or installing a system. So thank you. I hope everybody has a better feeling for groundwater and our surface water and the potability of both of those things. And it's a shared resource. And I hope there's a greater appreciation that regulations aren't just there to torture, but they're actually meant to preserve the things that are important to us. Thank you.
Pat, that was terrific and really highlighted the connections of having kind of one shared system with water and also its whole impact on the cycle, how our soil impacts our water, the runoff and infiltration. So I love the practical tips for improving our, what's easy steps we can all take to make a real difference. So thank you for that. So we have a good little chunk of questions and would welcome that others add more as well by putting them in the Q&A, not the chat. But I'll start off with our first question to the panel. Approximately what percentage of precipitation is lost to runoff in Greenwich?
You want me to address that one? I could probably, I mean, if you look back on my presentation, so I guess it depends on which way you look at it, but it's the number is roughly 50%. So about 50% of our rainfall is evapotranspiration, about 50% is ends up in a river.
Okay, terrific. Our next question is, how does the water supply in Connecticut compare to that of other states? And is our environmental approach different?
So I'll try to answer from the water scale. John, if you have anything you want to chime in, after I finish, feel free. It's I think it's a northeast water system. It was designed around primarily in New York City, Northern New Jersey, the New York area are designed around reservoir systems, the surface water systems. And they were really designed around the industrial, to serve the industrial needs from earlier in the century, and that's what's still in place. In some cases, like in the Bridgeport area, there's a lot of excess capacity because a lot of the industrial needs have gone away. But down here in an area like Greenwich, the residential demand has gone up, and you have that same thing. I'm originally from New Jersey. New Jersey has a similar thing. Newark, Jersey City have plenty of water, but the areas or the residences are a lot more residential has gone in. They're a little more stressed, or a little more up to their design capacity. So I think it's comparable. The one thing I would think, I was a little surprised here in Connecticut. I didn't realize I'm here 6 years now. Connecticut's a little more spread out than I expected. In New Jersey, there's more interconnections. Like there's more of an ability if one water system has trouble to move water from another water system. So like an MDC that has lots of water up in Hartford, in New Jersey, there's a little more of an ability to move water from northern part of the state to the central part of the state, or even down along to give them offset to the coast. So I think that's probably, and I think it's just the distance. There's just bigger gaps between the city centers here than there are in New Jersey.
Interesting. And while you're speaking, Jeff, another question. You were talking about the impact of the industrialized area previously and how the system had been set up for that. In Greenwich we really do talk about how residences use it and that seasonal irrigation use that skyrockets. But could you also comment, because there's not a lot of information on commercial or what I know we don't have a lot of industry in Greenwich, but what about the commercial users, and are they heavy in Greenwich? And does that also add to the demand? For example, we have a hospital, and so obviously they need a lot of water. And does that, we have a reputation of being water hogs in Greenwich, and I'm looking for other reasons why we might be such big water consumptions other than our penchant for emerald lawns. So.
In Greenwich, 2/3 of all the water use in Greenwich is residential. Okay. In what we call the commercial industrial only makes up 18% of the water use in Greenwich, and multifamily makes up about 10%. So by far the largest portion of the water use in Greenwich, and what Pat mentioned before, it's the summer demands. The summer demands that the commercial, like the hospital, may have high demands, but they don't go up as much in the summertime. You don't get a kick up. It's kind of a flat, a more consistent. Even the office buildings, their demands may go up some in the summertime, but they don't go up nearly as dramatically. So they're like in the case of the residential in Greenwich, it's more than double the water use. The winter, and you look at the summer demand, it's more than double the water use of the winter demand. In the industrial, it's only about 26-30% more. So it upticks in the summertime because of those outside uses, but it doesn't increase nearly to the level that the residential does.
Great answer. And Jeff, one last one I'll pull from our list here of questions while we have you. And what percentage of Greenwich is served by Aquarian? I know obviously we've got a lot of backcountry wells. But is there a number that you have for us on what percentage generally of households?
I may know it better. I don't know. We serve all the way up to the Merritt. So basically across the Merritt we don't serve across the Merritt. So I would guess that's probably what 85-90% of the residents I would think we serve. Pat, would you agree?
I'd seen a presentation before, maybe from right before Pat headed our department, and it was like 88%, something like that. And I was curious if that was still a relevant number.
I think that's still a relevant number. Yep.
Yeah, there's not been expansion of the public water service in a measurable way against the amount of development we already have that's served by public water. So that number probably won't change in a big way.
Terrific. And we had a question regarding the demand computer models and whether they take into account new construction, in fact.
Yeah, so we're required to do master plans as part of our permitting with the state, and they lay out like a 20-year time frame. So we take into account population increases. We look at zoning. We talk to each town, the planning departments in each town, and get an estimate of what they anticipate development-wise going forward, and we apply those. And then our plans include meeting those demands in the future. But nationally and even locally, the demands nationally are going down because of all the improved, well, by per person, demands are going down, and the Connecticut population is not going up dramatically. So really, our demands should be dropping because improved plumbing fixtures, reduced water use in showers and toilets, and all that type of stuff. Everything's getting more efficient. So, but really our demands are about flat because what's happening is more and more irrigation is going in, and it's offsetting some of that benefit we're getting from the plumbing improvements.
Oh, interesting. And speaking of which, question from Ms. Sesto: are there plans to require new construction, especially multi-dwelling units, to include groundwater systems to reduce the use of potable water to flush toilets and do laundry and such?
So those regulations actually come from the state health department. So it's not a decision that we are able to make locally.
Ah, okay, good to know. And you may have already spoken to this, but how does Greenwich rank with the rest of the state in water use per capita, if that's how it's measured?
I'll put that to Jeff.
They're the highest. Yeah, Southwest Fairfield. Yeah, so Greenwich is, of the towns we serve, 70, I think it's 71 towns, 74 towns in the state of Connecticut, and the Connecticut, Southwest Fairfield County. I mean, Connecticut is the highest, but Darien is high, New Canaan is high, Westport's high. It's where that end of the state is our highest users, and Greenwich is our highest users.
A frame of reference on that, in the summer months, so Greenwich is half the population of Stamford, but uses twice the water of Stamford.
Amazing.
Yeah, I was gonna add, I remember analyzing those water use data from back around 2000, and things may have changed a lot, but what was kind of shocking to me was as lot size went up, the water use went up dramatically with that, whereas you had the small lot size, you had kind of sort of more typical kind of state of Connecticut water use, but as you go up in lot size, there definitely was some big increases in the water used. And I also saw what Jeff was talking about, that increase in the summer demand, and looking at their, I guess the data I had came from you back in that time period. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
So,
so
and even
one third of Greenwich is the land cover type is lawn. 1/3. And 1/3 is developed, and then the rest is everything else. It's a lot. So
I have someone else put in a question about why is the North Street Reservoir empty? And I thought, Jeff, and I warned you about this, that actually I think it would be really helpful to hear about the Southwest Regional Pipeline.
Okay.
I don't know. In summary, I would say that that maybe people don't realize that with climate change that we're looking to, correct me if I'm wrong, but to divert water through a permit that Aquarian currently is doing, to divert water from, as you said, the Bridgeport system has excess water. And maybe you could explain a little bit about what people view as reservoirs here in Greenwich, and if that's really a holding capacity
Okay.
and all that.
Yeah. So I see a couple questions on here about, you know, what the reservoir stats. So I'll hit those, and I'll get to the Southeast Regional Pipeline. So the Greenwich system, the way the Greenwich system works is the barge reservoir is in Stamford, and it collects water there, and then we pump from that reservoir to what we call the Rockwood Reservoir, which is the reservoir that's along North Avenue there. The reason it's empty right now is there was a causeway, the roadway that crosses in the middle of the reservoir. Last year, a culvert collapsed. So working with the town, they're repairing that culvert right now. So they asked us, we had drained it, it had gotten down in the fall anyway, but then they asked us to keep it dry so they could do that repair. They now are very close to finishing the repair, and we've started filling it now. So if you look at our reservoir curves, they're lower than they normally would be for this time of year, but the barge reservoir is still spilling, and we're pumping water, and we'll be able to fill that reservoir. We expect it to be full by, definitely by the end of April, and then we top off, and then our reservoirs should be spilling in Greenwich. We don't expect any reason why they won't spill before, by May 1st or, in Greenwich. And we're using reservoir models for that, and it's giving, it's a very high, it's like over 95% likelihood that they're gonna spill this year. And the reason is the reservoirs in Greenwich have fairly large watersheds for the amount of water they store. So generally, there's a lot of spillage. So even though we're a little late filling Rockwood, there should be plenty of water to continue filling Rockwood. And then talking about the Southwest Fairfield, the Southwest Regional Pipeline. So what we do we've been bringing water down a regional pipeline for decades. There's been, when it was the Greenwich Water Company and the Stamford Water Company in New Canaan, there was a need, and there was a pipeline that was built even at that time to help those water systems by bringing water down. But it was really designed for the needs at that time, and it hasn't been increased. So the demands have gone up in those towns over the last 20 years. So we are looking, for an increase to increase that. And just that we have the stream flow requirements that are coming. They're going to require us to release more water from our reservoirs. So we'll also have less water in our reservoirs in addition to the additional demands. So we are pursuing a permit right now to increase the permit of how much water we can bring down from the Bridgeport system. And looking at the Bridgeport system has a lot of excess capacity. The Bridgeport system was really built to serve all that industry that was in Bridgeport for all those years. And there's a lot of excess capacity there. So we're trying to take advantage of it to serve, the state as best we can.
Can you explain a little bit more about the stream flow requirements? Because a lot of people, especially, it's interesting that John talked about the Mill Creek area at the very beginning, running dry. There's a lot of people in Fairfield who are concerned about their reservoirs and streams not already getting enough. And while it's great that maybe you said approximately 8 years from now that there would be a requirement for more downstream, it's scary to them to feel like we're diverting water, from those areas already, so that we can irrigate our lawns during the summer here in Greenwich, if we had to take a negative view on that. And is there a way to kind of tell them that or to increase the flow and allay their concerns? You talk about an excess. Maybe we could describe that more.
Yeah. So what there is there's a set of rules called the stream flow regulations, and it requires everybody who has a reservoir and a dam to release more water in the future. And the timing is based on when some studies were completed. So 10 years from the time that the work is completed, you have to start doing it. So we're in that. We estimate we have about approximately 100 million gallons of what we call safe yield, availability of everyday water demand in our reservoirs. We're going to go down to 85 million gallons a day after the stream flow regulations take effect. We're going to lose about 15% of our available safe yield because we're going to be releasing more water from our reservoirs. And I guess I understand the concerns in Fairfield, and John's probably more apt to talking about this than I am, but the reservoirs do release water. We do release water from our reservoirs currently to the streams in Easton as well as in Fairfield. And I think if you look historically, if the reservoirs weren't there, the stream flows would actually be lower in the summer than they are with our releases, because we do maintain a minimum release. And if the reservoirs weren't there and you had very dry summers, there would be even less water. So we maintain a level of release in the streams that wouldn't be there naturally. And that's in our calculations, in our management of the reservoir system. And so as part of the, that's also taken into account in these calculations and developing these long-term plans. So we have this release requirement and also meeting the demand, the customer demands as well.
Well,
John, do you have anything you want to add to that? You may have a little. Oh.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna add the Mill River I was showing is actually in the New Haven area. So, but it is a stream that's in the Regional Water Authority system. So but it's a little bit different system without much reservoir, and there's groundwater, and then sort of the end of the line right before you get to New Haven, there's like Lake Whitney, and that flows into Lake Whitney. So, so and there really isn't much ability to control the water that's coming down that particular stream, just because there's not a lot of storage there.
Well, the other question I had was if there's, so we have a good flow coming down from the barge reservoir to Greenwich, but also don't you have to maintain a certain amount of water for the reservoir and the water treatment plant in Greenwich, and to maintain kind of a healthy aquatic system for water quality? And is that something, and I don't think people realize, like these are small, what is actually in Greenwich is they're not that large, right? They can't be,
I mean,
we're holding from a holding perspective.
They're on the size of reservoirs are on the small side of reservoirs in the water industry. Our Saugatuck Reservoir is multiple times larger than the Greenwich reservoirs. And if you go out west, the ones out west, they hold years of water. They can, even MDC, I think they say they can hold up to 4 years of their demands in their reservoirs. So the Greenwich Stanford reservoirs they were built at the time they were built with the limitations of the valleys and the land around them at the time, but they're small in comparison to most reservoirs in the industry. And so we do manage them. I mean, so we have to, so there's that combination like you're talking about. We know we have a release requirement. We know what the demands are going to be, and we have to maintain water in the reservoir to go through our plants to produce, to meet the demands. And then there is an aquatic aspect of the reservoirs as well. So there's always some level of water we want to maintain in the reservoirs as well.
The other question we had was Greenwich, in some of the Aquarian notes that we've seen over time, we've talked about the transfer of water from the Greenwich treatment plant as part of the kind of regional pipeline to the Suez company that supplies Port Chester and Rye Brook and Rye through longstanding agreements. And did you want to touch on that? Because what one of my questions was, they don't seem to be having the same type of conservation message. We kind of checked on some of the towns in next door, and they were like, they weren't concerned about irrigation. I don't know that they have a 2-day ban, and was just curious about that, because we have made a real impact here in Greenwich, and I know that it's not our water, in that it's shared between New York State and Connecticut, but it does kind of make us wonder a little bit about it.
Yeah. So in 2016, we ran into this quite a bit. They got different rules in New York. It required, because it's connected to the New York system, in order to put restrictions in place, they had to go all the way. They were required to go all the way to the State Department of Health to impose the 2-day-a-week restrictions. They weren't allowed to do it locally. So there's a little different rules in New York. And I guess just to quickly summarize, tell a quick story about the overall. So the reservoir was built when there was Portchester Water Company and Greenwich Water Company. There were two water companies, and they got together to build the Barge Reservoir, which is in Stamford. It extends into New York. About half of the water body is in New York State. If you go up, it extends past the state border. And most of the watershed is actually in New York. Most of the water that gets into the Barge Reservoir is actually runoff from the state of New York. In addition to that, so we own the land that's in Stamford, but the Portchester Water Company, or now Suez, owns the land that's in New York. So it's a joint arrangement, a joint operation, joint ownership. So as part of that agreement.
Good evening, everybody. This is a meeting of the Greenwich Planning and Zoning Commission being held virtually pursuant to the governor's executive orders, which are currently set to expire, I believe, on April 19th. And hopefully we will be able to continue being virtual after that. Our first, we have no postponements.
What they can do with that 5 million gallons a day.
Right. And John, would you say that looking at your forecasting that there won't be any interstate wars the way there is out west with the demand for water between states and starting to be proprietary about your watersheds? I mean, it does seem to, we have heard that climate change means that we are going to get we are net positive on the water side, but can we depend upon that?
That's a good question. I think we can depend upon our ample water, but we may need to figure out better ways of kind of holding on to it when we get it. And, a lot of what Jeff is talking about is, having those systems that capture the water when it's available and being able to store it. Some of the things I mentioned about just more variability is something that seems to be coming. Whether we get extreme rainfalls on one end or whether we just get, we've had a few of these droughts. You can go back and look. I can think of, 1995, 2002. We had 2016. There's been a couple other ones in there too of some kind of dry years. We seem to be getting a drier spring. So I don't think we'll have those kind of issues. As long as we have the water available, I hope we won't be arguing amongst states. I've been doing work for our California office, and we're really blessed here as far as water goes in this part of the country. I was just reviewing a report today of the water supply for Fort Irwin in the Mojave Desert, and their largest source of recharge is recycled wastewater in that area too, where you get, if you might get 2, 3, or 4 inches of rainfall a year, and they're trying to basically mining old water in these desert basins. So, in a way, we're doing pretty well in this part of the country. And I often wonder, when I sit on the interagency drought work group here in Connecticut, and I've brought up the issue. We have development patterns over time, but maybe it will be our water that will turn the country more in this direction again at some point with our development, or looking for our ample water as being something that's pretty important.
Right. Excellent. I have a rather complicated question. I don't even know if I can read all of it, but it was directed toward Mr. Ulrich, and whether the implementation of Aquarian peak water surcharges might come into effect. It says the official Aquarian 2021 Greenwich system reservoir status shows 84.7% capacity as of March 9th, 2021. This is lower than the 20-year average, lower than 2016 drought year, and the past 2020 season, i.e. your slide number 9. So if the current rather dry weather continues through April, mid-May, we may have a new low record. Is Aquarian thinking of adding some sort of drought special surcharge for this peak usage period from July to September? However, limited to only those who actually use water in excessive ways or over normal average residential uses.
Well, I'll do my best.
It goes on.
So, from a reservoir perspective, like I said, we are lower than normal, but some of that is related to the Rockwood Reservoir being empty right now. And we expect that we will be able to, the reservoirs will be spilling by May 1st. That's our expectation based on our reservoir models that we use. About increasing the rates or having a higher rate. So we have a tariff. So what we do is rate cases. We have to go into PURA, the Public Utility Regulatory Authority, and you have to go in and get your rates approved. We haven't been in to get our rates approved for a while. And right now our rates are a flat rate. Everybody pretty much pays the same cost for every gallon of water. Our intent is when we go in for the next rate case is that we will be putting in some kind of what they call an increasing block rate. As you use more water, you'll pay more for it. But we have to go through a rate case in order to implement that. We can't implement that without getting that approved by our regulatory authority.
So that's interesting.
So
that
it wouldn't
could
be
apply,
this year.
so it could apply to.
But we do intend
the 1% of the high.
Yeah, well, that's. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that's if you, actually there was a conference today I was on earlier today with the Connecticut American Waterworks Association had a rate and water conservation conference, and and the discussions around the increasing block rate. Most places, particularly that are trying to conserve water or have an interest in conserving water, have already implemented an increasing block rate. So you have a base rate, up to what you think is a reasonable amount of water for a single house to use. And then if you get 50% above that, the rate goes up and then it goes up and then it goes up. So the people that are using those very, very high levels of water use have a financial, and it's really the fairest way to do it, because the reason we're having to do some of these additional work is to, is to satisfy those high demands at times. And so those people are really the ones should be paying for that, the cost of that infrastructure and the cost of putting those improvements in place. I did see a little bit in there too about the, I guess from my perspective, the conversation, I call it finding the most appropriate balance of water uses. Like John mentioned in his presentation, there's a lot of needs for water. There's fire protection, there's waste disposal, the showering, there's dishwashers, everything. And I do think I do think people like it. There's some aspect of a green lawn and a pool that people like and can enjoy. It's just what's finding the right balance of those uses. And I think what I showed on the one graph is there's a group of our customers that are using it way out of excess, in an excess, and we just need to get that group. Most of the customers are very, very water conscious and probably using it appropriately. It's just a small group of our customers that we have to try to modify their behavior and manage their demand a little bit, and it'll really, change the equation for everybody.
Yeah, and speaking of which, one question was, how can we encourage people to embrace pollinator pathway of landscaping to reverse the water usage ratio, so we can do better with our water conservation and look, nice at the same time. And how do we embrace the no lawn garden and that kind of thing? Pat, have you found best practices for that? I know our wonderful Alex Mock works so hard on pollinator pathways.
Does. Yeah, so Alex, the Conservation Commission, and through Alex's work, we are having pollinator pathways throughout town. And my hope is that, lead by example, and people will see that these are really lovely places. They're not scrubby and unkempt looking, that they look like they have intention and they are attractive. I would love to see any garden club people out there, when we have the garden tours, let's highlight the homes that have less lawn. And it's not no lawn, it's less lawn. How does some lawn complement other aesthetically pleasing landscape styles? Let's highlight those and sort of change our perception of what, expand our perception of what's beautiful in our residential landscape.
And just to address someone who did, I think I know the answer to this, but is Aquarian thinking of converting ocean seawater into fresh water? Israel knows how to do that very well. The city of San Diego invested in a $3 billion facility for its local usage. I know it's very energy intensive, but someone asked that
So
question.
there's two issues we have. So Connecticut, one thing that Connecticut does have, there's only 2 states in the country that have a requirement that drinking water supplies have to come from what they call Class 1 water bodies, which means they can't have any point discharges to them, no wastewater treatment plants or anything else upstream of them. New Jersey, where I'm from, there are lots of water treatment plants downstream of wastewater treatment plants. So the wastewater is going into the stream or the river, and the downstream they're taking it out with a water treatment plant and treating it and sending it to drink water. That does not happen in Connecticut. The rules don't allow that. And since Long Island Sound receives wastewater, there would have to be a really, really significant change to the rules of water use for us to even consider it as an option. In addition to that, if you look at the water cost options, the cost to develop that, the other options that we have available to us are a lot cheaper than to do the desal. And the environmental impact on desal is pretty significant. The waste that's generated, the energy usage, we would only use it in a very, very extreme circumstance, and we think there are other options that are more appropriate.
Yeah, I hear the salt is really what to do with the excess salinity is very difficult, where to put it and how to deal with it on a large scale basis. So interesting. And what else have we not asked? And then I had a question about, I mentioned to you before when we were having a conversation about the state water plan and what Aquarian is preparing for that. And for those that that don't know, the state has looked for years at putting some type of kind of memorandum of understanding on our water in Connecticut. And when you move in, do you own the water underneath your land? Is it your water, or can someone, as Pat was referring to, wells can make a big difference between what you're drawing out of your property and the impact on others. And, in that it's a shared resource, this water plan's rather exciting. Some of us looked at the issue of San Jose Water, the San Jose Water Company looked to go buy, and I think they completed the transaction, one of the water companies that was available for sale in Connecticut. And I know having contacts out in California and the Bay Area, I was like, they've got the message about our rainfall. And so it is an interesting question. And then, you do have, the Nestle Waters and people bottling water and using and selling that. And maybe that's not an issue for us, but for those of us that are trying to see that we're doing the right thing from a sustainability perspective, you wonder about that and wanting a water plan. And it was a significant hurdle to kind of put water in the public trust and who owns your water. I find the whole issue of water rights really interesting. So just curious what your take is on that and what Aquarian thinks.
We're like we discussed before, that they did, it is in a water plan now, that it's the trust. We don't really understand the full implications of that yet. I think there's still some, even as recently as 2016, when there were, I don't want to say which time, but there were people going in. So people didn't like our water restrictions, so they were going to the towns and drilling wells on their property so that they could irrigate outside the schedule because they didn't want to comply with the 2-day week. And a couple of the towns tried to stop the people and said, no, we're not going to authorize permits for drilling your own irrigation well right now during the drought. And it went all the way to the state attorney general's office, and they said, no, you don't have the right to stop someone from drilling a well on their own property. So there's still a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, that's going to have to take there. There is, I think anybody that's been involved in politics, there's a very strong sense of home rule in the Northeast. And, and I should be able to do on my property what I want to do with my piece of property. So I don't know if we know the full implications of that, but it's going to be a big jump before I think the politicians are going to be in a place to say someone can't put a well on their own property to supply their own property. So but we'll see what the outcome is. But the wording's there now. It's just a matter of where that goes.
Well, yeah, and if climate change continues to bless us with a decent amount of water, it may not have to really be looked at, but you just never know. That was kind of a surprising thing to me when a California water company is looking to diversify here. Pat, I had a follow-up question on understanding to what extent do you control, or can you control or institute the same things on, you touched upon it a little bit, but I was unclear about well users, well owners, and using their own water to irrigate that currently have existing wells in backcountry, for example.
That authority comes from an ordinance that Greenwich adopted a while ago now. Probably
It's on the order of 15, 20 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So it provides the municipality with the authority to implement restrictions on people's private wells.
And
so that is unique. And so any town that wants that sort of protection for the shared resource, each individual community has to adopt that ordinance. And as Jeff indicated, we don't have the authority to tell somebody they can't drill a well, nor does the health department, provided it meets all the health regulations. But it does allow us to deal with the level of use under specific circumstances.
And that would be, and the enforcement of that type of cycle would have to be on a reported basis of someone noticing that they were not adhering to a 2-day-a-week schedule.
Yeah, and we've had the same experience as Aquarian, that people who are watering off schedule maybe don't know about the schedule, or like, well, I have a new lawn, so I self-exempted. Generally, people have a reason beyond, no, I think I need it. That's very small fraction. In most cases, since I've been the director, we've not had to enforce anything. It's been a call or a letter, and that's all it's been needed to resolve the issue.
Right.
We've had the same experience. We do send drivers around, and we contact people who are watering outside the schedule. Now we hear one story: the irrigation contractors tell us that they're being told by some of their homeowners that to set it up, outside the schedule, and when they get caught, they'll change it. But in general, once we contact them one time, 85–90% of the people modify their schedule and get in conformance. There is a group of people that will argue about it and not be satisfied with it. So
there's always, no matter what it is, there's always a group, always a small number.
We also had a question in the chat about contact information for Jeff for questions that they might like to ask. So I don't know if there's any.
You can, when you send out the link, you can send my email address. I'm okay with it. I think you can find my email address on the website if you want to. But so when you send out the link, you can send out my email address.
Okay, this has been hot stuff. I think I've covered everything other than, do swimming pools draw on municipal water, or is that not allowed to fill your swimming pool?
Well, most swimming pools south of the Merritt would all be filled by aquarium water, I would think, in Greenwich.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, but in general, I'll be honest, swimming pools are not the issue, because in general they fill them and they top them off a little bit for evaporation. They aren't as big a water user as people think they are. It's really, where the real waste is in irrigation, and that's where the 2-day-a-week has all the benefit, is the irrigation contractor. If he sets the schedule on April 1st for 3 days a week, it's going to water April, May, and all of June 3 days a week. And it probably doesn't need to even be turned on until the second week of June. So you've wasted all that water for 2.5 months. There's really a month where you might need to water 2 or 3 times a week if you really wanted to. But then once you get to the second half of August and September, but that irrigation system is still going 3 days a week. That's the issue with the irrigation systems, is they set them, if you set them in April 1st to go 3 days a week, they're watering for 2.5 months for 3 days. Like, all that water you've taken out of the reservoir isn't there in July and August when you need it.
Exactly. And then another question was, how do you know that Greenwich's increase in water use every day of the week during 2020 was due to landscape watering rather than a general increase in domestic water use resulting from more people spending more time at home because of COVID? For example, showering at home rather than at the gym.
Yeah, there's definitely, well, what we could do now, we haven't done it yet, I'll be honest. We could compare it to the winter use. What you can do, what we generally do to figure out what outdoor water use is, you kind of look at January and February use, and you compare it to your summer use. January, February, we figure is all internal use, and it should go up a little bit in the summertime, but it wouldn't go up dramatically. Maybe you shower a little more often in the summertime, but it's not going to, double or triple. And then that's the difference. We haven't done that analysis. There's probably some of that. There were more people living in Greenwich, probably for longer periods of time, than they were in the, historically. So there's some of that. But is also we can see, is the morning demands. We start seeing our water levels, the demands kick up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't think there's that many people getting up and taking showers at 3 o'clock in the morning. So
Right, right. So it's pretty precise where that water is going. Okay, and here's another one. Out of total annual consumption in Greenwich, what is used by sports field? What is used most, I think, by sports field activities? Soccer, lacrosse, lawn tennis, golf.
Yeah. So if you I don't have that. So I said 18% was commercial, 10% multifamily. There are a couple more categories. We have what we call we have a category for government use. And it's a very small percentage in Greenwich. I think it's on your 1 or 2% of the water in Greenwich is used for government uses. So that includes their buildings, the schools, and their fields. So it's a small number. Golf courses we talked about. Yeah, I don't know how many grass fields there are. There is some irrigation in Greenwich, but I don't think that it's not as much as you think. In addition, we were talking about the golf courses before we got on. I looked at our numbers in Greenwich. We have the golf courses. They only used a total of 20 million gallons of our water last year in 2020 over a 6-month period. So it's not as much as you would think, but they do have ponds on site. They generally have their own wells that they're using. They usually only use our water when their systems are stressed. So I don't know what they use otherwise, but in the scheme of our water system, the golf courses aren't using a lot, and they wouldn't really impact us because they're generally downstream from our reservoirs. So their use wouldn't impact, water getting into our reservoirs.
And thank you for that. And another question, is Greenwich close to needing a cap on development due to water limitations?
I don't think so. I think we've taken into account the projections and our demands, and we don't anticipate any kind of restrictions on it. We can meet the development. There isn't that much more, and there isn't that much more developable land in Greenwich. And even, we get a lot of comments like this from people in Stamford. They're concerned about the high rises going in. And what we're finding in a lot of cases, the new development, the new buildings use a lot less water than the old buildings do. So even though they're adding more apartments and more residents in those buildings, they generally are at or even less water because their toilets, their showers, everything are much more efficient than what were in the buildings they replaced. So the new development isn't as big an issue for us to satisfy as people think it or would expect it to be.
And then Jeff, I would ask a question for you and for John. Have you heard a lot about streams that are not getting the flow they need? And, is that a big issue? And I, for example, was amazed to see that the Norwalk River has an incredible, I think it's trout fishing community that depends on that. And, obviously, our streams need to be cool enough to support the aquatic life and biodiversity. And I just was curious if in all of your travels, do you hear people saying, look, there is not enough water that we're because it is a legitimate concern, you know, when we're looking at putting drinking water on our lawns. And, you know, I was just curious, what is the reality check there? And for these places, say, for example, in Fairfield, where they're very concerned about the Mill Creek or the mill, you know, these are valid concerns. And are there ways, are you putting in, for example, meters, gauges and things like that to monitor it? And we're just not able to afford to do all of it. What do you think about stream demand right now in 2021?
Well, there are examples in the state where streams have dried. You know, like I don't know if everybody knows the story about Yukon, where there was a stream that was dried, moving water to satisfy the demands at Yukon, and there was a lot of a new project was involved in that. We, in general, you know, the stream, John could probably talk to it better than I can. The stream flows are impacted by wells. You know, that, you know, the reservoirs don't have that same impact because we're not pulling the water out of the groundwater. We're storing the ground. We're actually probably recharging some of the, you know, the groundwater from our reservoirs because the water is remaining there and is leaking, you know, getting into the ground to some level. In the cases of Fairfield, we do have streams, like we know what our, you know, and I think it's even on websites, what our releases are every day, going down the different, you know, the different stream releases from the reservoir. So there's a lot of documentation, a lot of history out there around what our releases are, and that they're at the same or, you know, or more than they have been historical. And then we do have a couple well fields in Fairfield that are down near, or Westport, I'm sorry, Westport, downstream of our reservoirs. But actually those capacities are dropping. So we're actually taking a lot less water out of those well fields than we have historically. So they should be having less impact on the stream than they have historically. Just because they're just getting old. The well fields are getting old and they just don't produce as much water as they used to. John, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
No, I was just going to add though, in this drought this summer, as I was telling before, I'm on the interagency drought work group. So one of the things that I do is, you know, the USGS maintains a large network of stream gauges around the state of Connecticut. We've got about 60 stations, as well as about 70 groundwater sites that we monitor, and that data goes into the state water, you know, into deciding on drought conditions in Connecticut that, you know, affect the use of water and, you know, some of the actions in the state drought plan. I would say the natural streams were the ones that were really dry in the summer, this past summer. So in a way, some of the sites with like reservoirs and all that upstream, you know, may have some requirements for releases downstream. So in my review of some of the data, it's kind of interesting. The Farmington River Basin and the Connecticut area, it's kind of interesting comparing our gauge data from back in the 1960s drought, which is really the drought of record, to say 2016. And one of the things that's really clear is that we manage water quite a bit differently than we did back then, where, you know, I think at that time we might have just shut off the flow or just kept pumping or whatever. So there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot more going on there, you know, at least as far as that goes. But yeah, you know, there are some other examples of streams drying up too as well. Sorry, what were you going to say, Jeff?
I'd agree with that. I think we do a lot more. I think the full environment, when I got in the industry 30 years ago, like John said, I think there was more, the water systems were, you know, they would take what the water they thought they were entitled to as much as they can. I think there's a lot more sensitivity in the industry around that, you know, the most appropriate use of water. You know, Easton, you know, we have Easton Reservoir in Easton, and we release a lot more water from it than we have to by permit. A lot more because we recognize the environmental benefit to the trout streams downstream of that and maintaining those. So I think the industry is doing a much better job than they did 30 years ago at trying to manage for all the different, you know, taking all the different parties into consideration.
Yeah, one of the other interesting things I was going to bring up is, especially when you look back 100 years or so, and not talking so much about our streams that we're taking drinking water from, because as Jeff mentioned, that I think some of our sort of late 19th century planning actually set us up pretty well for future water supply. and protecting lands and all those things. And that may be one of the things that's a lot different from other parts of the country as well. But one of the things I was going to say is in some of our waste receiving streams, like the Quinnipiac River, it's kind of interesting. Our base flows go up because we have, we take a lot of water for water supply out of the headwaters, and then it comes back in the lower reaches of the river as wastewater. And it's kind of interesting. We've actually seen that the summer stream flows in somewhere like the Quinnipiac River are much higher than they were, in the past. And the other difference really is we probably had a lot more regulation of streams in the far past too, especially if you think about New England as an industrial area. There were small dams everywhere, little factories. There were people that were holding back water. Think about the Hockanum River right here near our office in East Hartford. There used to be multiple dams on there that would hold the water back for several paper mills and things like that, even as recently as the 1960s. So there are a lot of changes in the way that we manage water in this time period since, kind of right around the time of the Clean Water Act, going back to like the 1970s.
Fascinating. And one last thing, John, do you want to touch at all about are you optimistic about Long Island Sound and what we've done? It's such a valuable resource to people in Greenwich and all of Connecticut. And I've seen Greenwich's water quality, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but it had been, I think, up at a B, and I think we dropped to a C. And I just was curious, whether we're really going to ever cure a lot of the problems we have with nitrogen. And John, what are your thoughts on that and the sounds, and how healthy is the sound now?
Well, I think there's a lot of improvements. There's clearly been some improvements in the area that we have hypoxia in the summer. And one of the biggest things is there was a total maximum daily load requirement for nitrogen that was started in cooperation with the state of New York back in 2001. And that requirement reduced the nitrogen loads from our wastewater treatment facilities in major rivers by, I believe it's 58%. So it's there's a huge amount of success there with the Connecticut's nitrogen credit trading program. That said, and I've also done a lot of trend analysis of nitrogen in our larger rivers, and it's definitely our nitrogen loads are way down. Where we see things not really changing so much are in some of the smaller rivers where we have the possibility of the contribution of non-point source pollutants. So, some of our rivers in like Fairfield County, we see we have monitoring going on like Sasko Brook, the Norwalk River. We see sort of creeping, increases in nitrogen loads in some of those. So, in areas where we're not sort of, doing that, the big heavy lifting of managing the wastewater, we still have this kind of, little bit of increasing development, and things like that that's been creeping in over the years. And so we maybe are not seeing either flat or maybe even slightly increasing in some of those areas too for nitrogen loads.
And so that would be fertilizer for.
I think, we think of some of the sources. Yeah, fertilizers, septic systems. Some of it is just, one of the interesting things of note though is that the atmospheric deposition of nitrogen has actually declined a lot as a result of the amendments for the Clean Air Act, that go back into the Clinton administration. So we've actually seen a big decline in nitrogen oxides and precipitation. So, it's a big plus, but one of the things that we're sort of looking at is our forested watersheds, how do they process that nitrogen? And, do you still have nitrogen that came in a long time ago that's still leaving to streams? And how is that going to change over time? We have forests that are maturing in the state and, those sort of things. And, that there's some unanswered questions as to, whether those areas are saturated with nitrogen or whether we start to see those, the nutrient loads come down from those areas as, say the air quality has improved.
That's encouraging to hear, that some things are working. So great to know. Well, you all have been incredible. This has been great. I mean, we now hit the 2-hour mark and we still have a major portion of our attendees still listening. So haven't gone to get dinner or a glass of wine yet. So thank you so much. Pat, do you want to close us out or any other further comments? I will say a big shout out to Alex Mock, who put together this incredible panel, this incredible series. I find it so interesting, and I know it was a lot of hard work, and she's just amazing. So thank you,
Let's
Alex.
put together a good program. Yeah, that's Alex's vacant seat. That's her,
That's right.
her office, so, but she's connected via phone, so she's been listening.
The whole thing. So
First period. And just to thank you to Jeff and to John for making the time to, again, generous with your time and helping out Greenwich to understand these very important water issues, and always appreciative to have your expertise.
My pleasure.
Yes.
And
Thank
Laura,
you.
thank
I
you.
appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Come back next week, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Will
Take
do.
care and have a
Good
good
night.
night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.